The August morning in Pinewood, South Carolina, hung heavy with humidity, a damp shroud that pressed against the skin and turned every movement into a slog. James Carter stepped out of his rusted sedan, its faded blue paint chipped and peeling under the relentless sun. He'd parked in a shadowed corner of the police precinct's lot, where the asphalt buckled and weeds clawed their way through the cracks. Dressed in a threadbare plaid shirt with frayed cuffs, jeans worn thin at the knees, and sneakers so scuffed they barely held their shape, he looked nothing like the newly appointed police chief. That was deliberate. James had no use for the polished fanfare of an official welcome or the sanitized reports that glossed over ugly truths. He wanted the raw, unvarnished reality of the Pinewood precinct, a place where whispers of misconduct had long since swelled into a quiet chorus, eroding the fragile bond between the badge and the community it served. To uncover that, he'd come undercover, a phantom slipping through the daylight. James tugged the brim of his baseball cap lower, shielding his eyes from the sun's glare as it climbed above the hills. He took a slow, deep breath, the air thick with the mingled scents of pine sap, gasoline fumes, and the faint musk of damp earth. The weight of his mission settled on his shoulders like a yoke, heavy but familiar. 2 decades in law enforcement had forged him, years spent navigating hostile precincts, facing down resistance that tested his resolve, climbing the ranks through sheer grit in cities far rougher than this. Pinewood, though, was its own beast. Tucked among the rolling hills of South Carolina, it was a small town of sagging porches, winding roads lined with oak, and a population that leaned white and watchful. The police force here was a tight-knit clique, their reputation stained by years of unchecked arrogance and bias. As a black man stepping into leadership, James knew he'd be walking into a hornet's nest. Some would bristle at his presence, others might outright defy him. He hadn't come to win their affection, though. He'd come to rip out the rot and rebuild something worth a damn. The precinct parking lot thrummed with early morning life. Officers milled about, some leaning against patrol cars with radios crackling static, others sharing cigarettes and low chuckles near a rusted bench bolted to the pavement. A few glanced at James as he crossed the lot, their eyes skimming over him without a flicker of recognition, just another stranger in a town that didn't take kindly to outsiders. Perfect. His appointment had been announced days earlier, a curt memo buried in the avalanche of departmental paperwork, and he'd delayed his official debut to exploit the fog of transition. No one expected the new chief to roll up looking like he'd wandered off a back road. James moved with purpose but kept his stride loose, his hands stuffed in his pockets as he slipped through the precinct's side entrance unnoticed. Inside, the air shifted, cooler but stale, laced with the acrid bite of burnt coffee and the faint hum of fluorescent lights bouncing off glossy tile floors. The hallways buzzed with activity, officers hunched over desks, flipping through dog-eared reports with coffee-stained edges, others clustered near a vending machine that rattled and groaned with every coin it swallowed. James drifted through the space, his eyes sharp behind the shadow of his cap, taking in the scene with a predator's patience. He noted the easy banter that flowed between some, the sharp barks of command from others, the way certain voices carried authority while quieter ones faded into the hum. No one spared him a second glance, their focus locked on their own routines, and that suited him just fine. He paused near the break room, a cramped nook with a sagging couch, a flickering TV mounted high in the corner, and a microwave humming as it warmed someone's forgotten lunch. He intended to linger, to listen, to peel back the layers of this place and see what festered beneath. "Hey, you!" The voice sliced through the ambient noise, sharp and edged with command. James turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered officer striding toward him, his uniform crisp despite the heat, his posture rigid with self-assurance. The name tag on his chest gleamed under the lights, Bradley. Behind him, a handful of officers lounged against the wall, their eyes glinting with amusement, their postures casual but attentive. James opened his mouth to respond, but Bradley cut him off, his lips curling into a smug grin. "Lost, are we? This isn't a flophouse for vagrants," he sneered, his tone thick with disdain, each word dripping like venom. "Take that mess somewhere else." The insult landed hard, a jab that stung but didn't surprise. James stood still, his mind racing through his options: reveal himself now and shut this down, or let the scene play out and see how deep the poison ran. Before he could decide, Bradley stepped closer, his voice rising to draw the eyes of the growing crowd. "Didn't you hear me? Get out of here. We don't need your kind hanging around." Laughter erupted, harsh and jagged, bouncing off the walls like shrapnel. James's fists clenched at his sides, his pulse hammering in his ears, but he kept his face a mask of calm, betraying nothing. He started to speak, to offer a measured reply that might defuse or redirect, but Bradley leaned in, his breath hot and sour with the tang of chewing tobacco, and then, without warning, spat directly into James's face. Time slowed to a crawl, the world narrowing to that single, humiliating act. The warm saliva slid down James's cheek, a slow drip that prickled his skin and set his nerves ablaze. Around him, the laughter swelled, raucous, unrestrained, a chorus of mockery. One officer slammed a hand on the table, doubling over with glee, his guffaws echoing through the room. Another muttered, "Teach him his place," under his breath, the words half lost in the noise but clear enough to cut. James's chest tightened, anger surging like a wildfire through his veins, hot and bright and begging for release. But he tamped it down, years of discipline locking it behind a wall of steel. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a handkerchief, and wiped his face with slow, deliberate motions, each swipe a silent refusal to break. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked, his voice steady, cutting through the din like a blade through cloth. Bradley smirked, unfazed, his eyes glinting with malice. "Only the ones who don't belong here," he shot back, his tone a taunt meant to provoke. The group burst into laughter again, feeding off each other's mirth, their voices a wall of sound that pressed against James from all sides. He said nothing. He folded the handkerchief with precision, tucked it back into his pocket, and turned away, his footsteps echoing against the tile as he walked down the hall toward the precinct's main office. Behind him, the jeers faded, swallowed by the crackle of the intercom overhead, all personnel to the briefing room immediately. The briefing room was a hive of noise as officers trickled in, their voices a low rumble against the scrape of metal chairs and the clink of coffee mugs against tabletops. Some clutched steaming cups, the faint aroma of burnt grounds wafting through the air, others swapped jabs and chuckles over half-remembered stories from the night shift, arrests gone sideways, bar fights broken up, the usual grind. James slipped in through a side door, now carrying a folder stamped with the precinct's official seal, its edges worn from handling. He stood just out of sight, his back pressed to the cool cinderblock wall, watching the room fill with bodies. Bradley leaned against a far corner, arms crossed over his chest, his smug grin still plastered across his face, as if the morning's events were a badge of honor he'd pinned to his ego. The others, some still snickering from the break room incident, settled into their seats with the ease of routine, their chatter a dull roar that filled the space. Captain Thompson, a stout man with a graying mustache and a voice like gravel scraped over stone, stepped to the front and clapped his hands twice, the sound sharp enough to cut through the din. "All right, settle down, everyone," he barked, his tone a mix of weariness and authority. "We've got an important introduction today. As you know, Chief Miller retired last month, took his fishing pole and his pension and left us holding the bag. We've been waiting for his replacement, and I'm pleased to present our new leader, a man with an impressive record and a vision for this department." James stepped forward, his movements deliberate, each footfall a quiet declaration that reverberated through the stillness. The room froze as he crossed to the podium, his presence shifting the air like a storm rolling in over the hills. He set the folder down with a soft thud and let his gaze sweep the crowd, slow and unflinching, taking in every face, every flicker of reaction. The chatter died instantly, replaced by a taut, electric silence that crackled with anticipation. Bradley's smirk wavered, his eyes narrowing as a flicker of recognition sparked, then flared. The other officers shifted in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances, some whispering under their breath, others staring with mouths slightly agape, caught off guard by the figure before them. "Good morning," James began, his voice calm but resonant, filling the space like a tide washing over jagged rocks. "My name is James Carter. As of today, I'm your new chief of police." The silence deepened, thick and suffocating, pressing down on the room like a weight. Bradley's face flushed a deep crimson, his bravado crumbling like dry earth underfoot, his arms dropping to his sides. James held his gaze for a beat longer than necessary, letting the moment stretch, then moved on, taking in the sea of faces, some pale with shock, others dark with unease. "When I arrived this morning," he continued, "I came in plain clothes because I wanted to see this department through an unfiltered lens. No scripts, no masks, just the truth. What I witnessed was eye-opening." A murmur stirred, a ripple of unease that spread through the crowd, but James raised a hand, silencing it with a single gesture. "In my brief time here, I've already seen behaviors that aren't just unprofessional, they're unacceptable. Let me make one thing clear, the culture that's been allowed to fester here, the rot that's taken root in these walls, ends today." The words landed like stones, sending ripples through the stillness, each syllable weighted with intent. Bradley shifted, his eyes dropping to the floor, sweat beading on his brow and glistening under the harsh lights. James stepped closer to the edge of the podium, his tone sharpening without rising, cutting through the air with precision. "Respect isn't optional. It's the foundation of what we do as law enforcement. It's the bedrock we stand on, or should stand on. Without it, we fail, not just each other, but the community we swore to serve." He paused, letting the silence stretch, watching the officers squirm under the weight of his scrutiny, their discomfort a palpable thing. "This morning, some of you laughed at what you thought was just another powerless man being put in his place, someone you could kick around without consequence. But let me remind you, everyone who walks through those doors deserves respect, whether they're wearing a badge or a pair of ragged shoes." His voice sliced through the room, precise and unrelenting, a blade honed by years of standing firm. No one moved, the air thick with tension. James let it build, his gaze steady as steel, sweeping over the crowd like a searchlight. Bradley fidgeted again, his discomfort etched into every twitch of his frame, but James pressed on, undeterred. "I understand change is difficult," he said, his tone steady but laced with an authority that brooked no argument. "It's messy, it's hard, and it's going to ruffle feathers. But there will be no tolerance for behavior that disrespects the dignity of any individual, colleague, civilian, or otherwise. Not under my watch." He stepped down from the podium, closing the distance between himself and the officers, his boots clicking against the tile in a rhythm that punctuated the stillness. "Officer Bradley," he said, stopping a few feet from the man, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. Bradley flinched, his earlier swagger gone, replaced by a twitch of unease that danced across his features. "You represent everything that's broken in this department, every crack in the foundation, every stain on the badge. When you spat in my face, it wasn't just me you disrespected. It was the oath you took, the uniform you wear, and the community we swore to protect. Bradley stammered, his voice shaky and thin, barely audible over the silence. Chief, I didn't know. That's exactly the problem, James interrupted, his words crisp and cutting, each one landing like a hammer strike. You didn't care to know. You didn't pause to think before you acted because you assumed the man in front of you didn't matter, assumed he was nothing, nobody. That assumption, that arrogance, is why this department has lost the trust of the people it serves. It's why they look at us with suspicion instead of hope. The room held its breath, every officer rooted in place, the weight of his words pinning them where they sat. James turned to the group, his voice rising slightly, carrying a controlled intensity that filled the space. What I saw wasn't just one man's mistake. It was a culture where bullying and prejudice aren't just tolerated but celebrated, where power is a club to swing instead of a shield to wield. That stops now. Right here, right today. He stepped back to the podium, his presence towering despite his unassuming frame, filling every inch of the room with quiet command. I've spent my career fighting for justice, not just out there on the streets, but in places like this, within these walls where it's supposed to start. Change won't be easy. It won't be quick. It won't happen overnight, and it sure as hell won't happen without pushback. But as long as I'm chief, this precinct will operate with integrity, respect, and accountability, no exceptions, no excuses. James paused, letting his words settle into the bones of the room, sinking deep into the cracks of their complacency. Then he gave a slight nod to Captain Thompson, who stood off to the side, his mustache twitching with something between unease and approval. Effective immediately, Officer Bradley is suspended pending review, James said, his voice firm as bedrock. And for those of you who think this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is the first of many changes, consider it a warning shot. Gasps rippled through the crowd, a collective intake of breath that broke the silence like glass shattering. Bradley's face burned red, his jaw clenching tight as he avoided the stares boring into him from all sides, his hands balling into fists at his sides. James stood tall, unshaken, his voice unwavering. This isn't about punishment, he said, his tone resolute. It's about setting a standard, a line in the sand. If you're not willing to rise to it, if you can't meet it, then this isn't the place for you. The door's right there. He swept his gaze across the room one last time, locking eyes with each officer in turn, a silent challenge hanging in the air like smoke. If you're ready to do better, to be better, we'll move forward together. We'll build something worth believing in. But know this, I will hold you accountable every step of the way. Every choice, every action, every word. The meeting dissolved into a heavy silence, the kind that smothered sound and left only echoes. Officers shuffled out, their usual banter replaced by a subdued murmur, footsteps dragging against the tile as if weighed down by the moment. James lingered at the podium, watching Bradley storm off, his shoulders hunched with a volatile mix of shame and fury, his boots slamming the floor with every step. The others kept their heads down, their expressions a mosaic of guilt, unease, and quiet reflection. Some stole glances at James as they passed, their eyes flickering with questions they didn't dare voice, their hands stuffed in pockets or clutching folders like shields. In his new office, James sank into the chair behind a desk buried under files, memos, and a chipped coffee mug left behind by the last chief. He exhaled deeply, the tension of the morning draining from his body like water through a sieve, leaving him weary but resolute. The room was small, its walls bare save for a faded map of Pinewood tacked crookedly above the desk, its edges curling with age. A single window let in a sliver of sunlight, dust motes dancing in the beam as it sliced through the gloom. He knew this was only the first skirmish in a long, bruising war. Attitudes calcified over years wouldn't soften in a day, and some might never yield, might cling to their old ways like barnacles to a hull. But he hadn't come to Pinewood to make friends or soothe egos, he'd come to forge change, to hammer out something solid from the wreckage of what had been. The phone on his desk buzzed, jolting him from his thoughts, its shrill ring cutting through the quiet. He picked it up, the receiver cool against his ear. It was Captain Thompson. "Chief, I wanted to say you handled that better than most would have," Thompson said, his gravelly voice tinged with a cautious respect, the kind earned rather than given. "Not sure I could have kept my cool like that." "Thanks, Captain," James replied, his tone even but threaded with fatigue. "But the real work starts now. I need a full review of Bradley's history on my desk by tomorrow, complaints, incident reports, write-ups, everything. I want the whole picture." "You've got it," Thompson said, pausing for a beat, his breath audible through the line. "And Chief? I think you shook a few of them today, rattled some cages. In a good way, I mean." James hung up, a faint flicker of satisfaction warming his chest, a small ember in the cold expanse of the task ahead. He leaned back, staring at the ceiling where a water stain bloomed in one corner, its edges feathering out like a bruise. Then he turned to the mountain of paperwork awaiting him, shift schedules, budget requests, a stack of citizen complaints yellowed with age. Over the next few weeks, the precinct shifted subtly but perceptibly, the air growing taut with change. Officers who'd once egged Bradley on now steered clear, their laughter replaced by hushed conversations about his suspension, their voices low as they traded theories in the locker room or over lukewarm coffee. Whispers spread through the halls, some resentful, others curious, a few tinged with grudging respect, like a tide turning slow but sure. James made it a habit to walk the corridors daily, his boots echoing against the tile, offering nods and brief greetings to those he passed. "Morning, Ortiz, good work on that call, Hayes." His presence was a quiet but constant reminder of the new order, a shadow that loomed without dominating. He listened more than he spoke, catching snippets of talk, grumbles about overtime, debates over patrol routes, the occasional jab at the new guy that faded when he drew near. Some avoided his gaze, their shoulders stiff, others met it, tentative but open, testing the waters of this unfamiliar terrain. Some embraced the shift, their steps hesitant but genuine. Officer Sarah Evans, a young recruit with sharp eyes and a quiet demeanor that belied her steel, approached him one afternoon in the break room. The space was empty save for the hum of the vending machine and the faint crackle of a radio playing country tunes in the distance. She stood by the coffee pot, clutching a styrofoam cup, her knuckles white around its rim. "Chief," she said, her voice low but firm, cutting through the stillness, "I've been silent too long. I've seen things, heard things, jokes that weren't funny, rough hands that didn't need to be. I didn't call it out because I was afraid of rocking the boat, of being the odd one out. I want to do better." James met her gaze, his expression softening just enough to ease the tension in her shoulders, a flicker of warmth breaking through his usual reserve. "That's all I ask, Evans," he said, his tone kind but unyielding, steady as a pulse. "It starts with you, one voice, one choice. You don't have to shout to shift the tide." She nodded, a flicker of resolve hardening her features, her jaw setting as she straightened. "I'll try, sir," she said, then walked away with her head a little higher, her steps surer than before. James watched her go, a quiet pride settling in his gut, a small victory in a war of inches. But not everyone was so willing to bend. Bradley filed an appeal against his suspension 2 days later, his written statement a tangle of indignation and defiance, claiming bias and unfair treatment, targeted for doing my job, he'd scrawled in blocky letters. James reviewed the case personally, spending late nights poring over the man's record under the dim glow of a desk lamp that buzzed faintly with age. The file was a grim archive: excessive force complaints from 3 years back, documented slurs scrawled in shaky civilian handwriting, a string of warnings ignored or dismissed, a pattern of arrogance stretching across a decade like a stain that wouldn't wash out. The appeal was denied by week's end, and James sent a clear message through a precinct-wide memo, its words stark on the page: the days of brushing misconduct under the rug were over. No exceptions, no second chances for those who wouldn't learn. Rather than lean solely on disciplinary measures, James pivoted to a broader strategy, one that reached beyond the precinct's cinderblock walls and into the streets of Pinewood. A week after the briefing, he mandated a training session for the entire force, centered on ethics, de-escalation, and community relations, skills he knew had atrophied here, replaced by bravado and shortcuts. He brought in Laura Simmons, a no-nonsense expert on implicit bias with a reputation for cutting through excuses like a blade through silk, her name whispered in law enforcement circles with equal parts awe and dread. She arrived the following Monday, a wiry woman with gray-streaked hair pulled into a tight bun, her eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses, her voice carrying without effort. Bradley, under direct orders from Thompson, attended, slouching in the back row of the briefing room with his arms crossed, his face a mask of resentment, his boots scuffing the floor as he shifted. Laura stood at the front, her presence commanding despite her small frame, a quiet intensity radiating from her as she clicked on a projector. Grainy footage of police encounters gone wrong flickered across the screen: shouts, shoves, a nightstick raised too fast. "We all carry assumptions," she said, pacing before the rows of officers, her boots tapping a steady rhythm against the tile. "They're baked into us, by upbringing, by experience, by the world we live in. They're not the problem. The problem is when you let them drive your decisions, when you act without thinking because you're sure you've got it all figured out." She posed hard questions, about snap judgments made in the heat of a call, about the power imbalance of a badge, about the cost of unchecked impulses when lives hung in the balance. She didn't soften the edges, didn't shy away from the discomfort that followed, her voice a steady drumbeat that forced them to listen. Some officers shifted uneasily in their seats, their pens idle, their eyes darting to the exits, others scribbled notes, brows furrowed as they wrestled with her words. Bradley stared at the floor, his jaw tight, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm against his arm, but he stayed silent, his usual bluster muted under the weight of her scrutiny and James's watchful eye from the side of the room. The session stretched into the afternoon, punctuated by role-playing exercises that left a few officers red-faced and stammering, their confidence unraveling under Laura's gaze. She paired them up, handed out scenarios: a domestic dispute spiraling out of control, a traffic stop teetering on the edge of violence, a loitering call that could go either way, and watched as they fumbled through responses. "Slow down," she'd say, cutting in when tempers flared or assumptions took over, her voice calm but firm. "Think. Who's in front of you? What do they need? What's the goal here?" James observed from the sidelines, arms crossed over his chest, noting who resisted and who leaned in, who clung to old habits and who dared to stretch beyond them. Evan surprised him, stepping up to de-escalate a mock argument with a calm that belied her years, her voice steady as she talked down an agitated suspect, played by a gruff veteran named Ortiz. Bradley, paired with Ortiz later, muttered through his turn, his answers clipped and sullen, his eyes flicking to James as if daring a rebuke that didn't come. James didn't stop at training. He rolled out a new initiative the following day, assigning every officer a community service task, effective immediately, no exceptions. They'd spend weekends volunteering, cleaning up parks littered with broken bottles and cigarette butts, painting over graffiti scrawled on brick walls in angry red loops, repairing playgrounds where rusted swings creaked in the wind and slides sagged under years of neglect. "You want the community to trust you," he told them at the next briefing, his voice firm over the rustle of papers and the shifting of boots against the floor. "Earn it. Step by step. Show them who you are when the badge isn't a shield to hide behind or a club to swing." The grumbling started low but grew as the days passed, a chorus of discontent that echoed through the halls. "This isn't in the job description," one officer muttered in the locker room, loud enough for James to overhear as he passed, his locker slamming shut for emphasis. "What's next? Bake sales? Charity runs?" another chimed in, earning a few snickers from the benches. James let it slide, for now. Change didn't come without friction, and he'd expected the pushback, the creak of old gears grinding against new ones. He joined the first outing himself, showing up at Pinewood Park on a Saturday with a paintbrush in hand and a bucket of whitewash at his feet, the sun beating down through a haze of clouds. Sweat soaked through his shirt as he worked alongside a crew of officers, some sullen, others quiet, and a handful of local teens who lingered nearby, watching with wary eyes from the edge of the grass. A girl named Mia, small and wiry with braids swinging as she moved, edged closer after an hour, her curiosity winning out over caution. She wore a faded yellow dress that hung loose on her frame and sneakers with holes at the toes, her hands stuffed deep in her pockets. "Are you really the chief?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, her brown eyes wide with a mix of doubt and wonder, searching his face for the truth. James set his brush down, wiping his hands on his jeans before offering a smile, small but warm. "I am," he said, keeping his tone light but steady, meeting her gaze without flinching. "My brother says cops don't care about us," she said, kicking at a clump of dirt with her toe, her words soft but heavy with the weight of lived experience. "Says you're all the same, out for yourselves." James crouched to her level, the ache in his knees a small price for closing the distance, for meeting her on her ground. "I can't change what your brother's seen, Mia," he said gently, his voice low and earnest. "I can't erase the past or the hurt that's come with it. But I promise you this, we're working to do better, to be better. If you ever need help, you come find me, okay? I'll be here." She studied him for a long moment, her eyes narrowing as if weighing his words against some internal scale, then nodded, a shy smile breaking through like sunlight piercing clouds. She darted back to her friends, who whispered and giggled as she relayed the exchange, their voices a soft buzz in the distance. James watched her go, a quiet resolve settling in his chest, a spark of purpose reigniting amidst the grind. Moments like that, they were the embers he'd stoke into something lasting, the small victories that kept him pushing forward. Weeks turned to months, and the precinct began to transform, however unevenly, like a river carving new paths through stubborn stone. Bradley returned after his suspension, his appeal denied, but he kept his head down, his bravado muted by the weight of scrutiny that followed him like a shadow. He worked his shifts in silence, his eyes avoiding James's in the halls, his once loud presence reduced to a ghost of itself, a hollow echo of the man who'd spat without a second thought. Others leaned into the shift, their steps tentative but growing surer. Evan started a peer accountability group, meeting weekly in a back room to hash out tough calls and share mistakes, her voice gaining strength with each session. Thompson took to mentoring younger recruits, drilling them on de-escalation tactics with a gruff patience James hadn't expected from the old-timer, his mustache twitching as he barked corrections. The community noticed, too, the change seeping out beyond the precinct's walls. Complaints trickled down, fewer angry letters piling up on James's desk, their venom replaced by cautious questions or the rare thank yous scrawled in shaky cursive. Officers started showing up at local events unprompted, block parties with sizzling grills and kids darting through the smoke, school fairs with sticky-fingered children tugging at their sleeves, their uniforms a little less stiff, their smiles a little more real, their hands offering help instead of hovering near holsters. James watched it unfold from his office window, the glass streaked with years of grime, and felt the first stirrings of something like progress, fragile but tangible. One evening, months after that first tumultuous day, James stood in the precinct's main hallway, leaning against the wall as officers filed out after a long shift, their voices a low hum against the buzz of neon lights overhead. The air smelled of sweat and coffee, the tile beneath his boots scuffed from years of wear. Their laughter rang out, lighter now, not edged with malice but warm with a budding camaraderie that felt earned rather than forced, a sound that hadn't existed here when he'd arrived. He crossed his arms, the faint ache of fatigue settling into his bones, and let himself linger in the moment, soaking it in. The road ahead stretched long and rough, old habits died hard, and trust was a fragile thing, slow to mend, easily broken. But for the first time since he'd stepped into this town, James felt a flicker of hope, a quiet certainty that the ground was shifting beneath them, however incrementally. He turned back to his office, the door creaking as he pushed it open, its hinges groaning in protest. The desk still groaned under a mess of paperwork, shift schedules scribbled with last-minute changes, budget requests drowning in red ink, a half-finished report on community outreach stained with coffee rings. The phone buzzed incessantly, a lifeline to the outside world that never slept, its shrill ring a constant companion. But the air felt different now, charged with possibility, thick with the scent of change, a mix of dust, determination, and the faint promise of something better. James sat down, pulled a file toward him, and got back to work, the pen steady in his hand as he scratched out notes. Outside, the sun dipped below the hills, painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold that bled into the dusk. In the parking lot, a group of officers lingered by their cars, swapping stories from the day, a stolen bike recovered from a ditch, a kid reunited with his mom after wandering off, a quiet thank you from an old woman on Elm Street who'd slipped them a plate of cookies. James heard their voices through the cracked window, a faint echo of something new taking root, something alive and growing. He smiled to himself, the smallest curve of his lips, a private acknowledgement of the fight so far, and turned the page. Pinewood wasn't perfect, not yet, maybe not ever. The scars of its past ran deep, etched into the streets and the souls who walked them. But it was moving, inch by hard-won inch, step by grudging step, and that was enough to keep him here, to keep him pushing. He'd come to break a cycle, to build a bridge, and he'd stay until the job was done, or until it broke him first. For now, though, he had this, a precinct stirring awake, a community peering through the cracks, and a promise he intended to keep. It wasn't everything, but it was a start.